They told you the world is shaped by circumstances. And what if I tell you that everything you see, touch, and feel is born from your imagination? And I will reveal how this hidden power is already within you, waiting to be awakened. I will reveal how belief can rewrite reality itself. And I will reveal the secret that those who master this art move mountains without ever leaving their minds. This is how it unfolds, in a dim room before sleep, where the lights are softened and your breath has slowed so that every small sense, your palms against imagined wood, the faint scrape of a shoe on a rung, the subtle shift of weight, becomes a field of impression. And Neville's instruction is simple and surgical. Make the inner scene so tactile and emotionally true that the deeper mind accepts it as fact, and the machinery of your life begins, almost imperceptibly, to answer to that acceptance. This is where the illusion deepens, because Neville deliberately set a paradox. Students were told to write, "I will not climb a ladder," while each night they climbed one in imagination. And that deliberate contradiction exposes the split between the doubting daytime intellect and the unquestioning registrar of nocturnal experience, showing how a vivid imaginal act can override conscious denial when felt with sufficient conviction. This is why it matters, for the ladder is chosen as a neutral instrument to remove arguments about motive, so that the result cannot be dismissed as mere wishful thinking, but must be read as demonstrable method. Impress the deeper mind with a detailed, sensory scene, and watch the outer world recompose itself around that internal fact. This is the turning point, when skepticism collides with experiment, and the student who laughed finds ladders appearing in dreams, on building sites, or even as unexpected tasks in the choreography of an ordinary week. And that small collision becomes the portal through which one sees that resistance is a habit to be outlived rather than an immutable law. This is how freedom announces itself. For once you can carry the feeling of the wish fulfilled with the same settled certainty you would feel after an achieved victory. You stop pacing for circumstances to change and begin to inhabit a state that draws circumstances into alignment, and Neville's oft-repeated aphorism, "Feeling is the secret," becomes an operating principle you can practice nightly until it saturates your waking choices. This is why circumstances lose power, because the subconscious answers to lived experience, not to argument, and when you repeatedly give it the internal evidence of completion, it abandons the old script and begins to script events that match the new inner narrative. So that limitation starts to peel away like old paint from a wall. This is how destiny is rewritten. When you replace the ladder with an office you have already walked into, the handshake you have already completed, the conversation you have already been through. Load those scenes with precise sensory detail, the exact phrasing you heard, the ambient sounds and smells, and the deeper mind reads a blueprint so specific it compels the world to furnish corresponding facts. This is the test of faith, and practically speaking, the technique asks for patience without measuring and repetition without anxiety, because the subconscious does not count days, but impressions. So stop the habitual checking that collapses the state by doubting its existence, and instead insist inwardly on the completion you have chosen. This is the proof that imagination speaks. And though Neville's reports and students' anecdotes about ladders are the illustrative hook, what will convince you are the small, accumulating confirmations. A conversation that echoes your scene's sudden appointment dream image that repeats. So keep a quiet ledger of these micro-evidences, rather than hunting for a single spectacular sign. This is the moment the student hesitates. And for those who struggle with clear imagery, the remedy is practical. Borrow tactile memories. A rail under the hand, the creak of worn wood, the lift of the calf. Fold those sensations into the imagined climb and let feeling, not fanciful detail, be the bridge into the deeper acceptance. This is how doubt becomes a tool rather than a trap. Or when doubtful thoughts arise, do not wage war on them but place them at the margin of practice. Observe them with curiosity and return to the stronger inner fact, so that doubt becomes a lens sharpening your attention rather than a storm that scatters it. This is where the subconscious listens, and a useful metaphor is to think of it as fertile soil that will accept any seed you bury. So choose the seed, emotion, sensory richness, conviction, and nourish it nightly, until the outer garden begins to mirror what you have cultivated within. This is the quiet before evidence, and the discipline you cultivate looks like small shifts in conduct, decisions made from the assumption of fulfillment, speech that reflects accomplished status, and behavior nudged by an inner yes instead of outer lack, which in turn draws opportunities that previously lay invisible on your path. This is the first unexpected echo, when a casual remark, an advertisement, or an offhand invitation resonates with your inner scene, and you feel a prickle of recognition that acts as breadcrumb evidence. The unseen is rearranging to meet the felt reality. Learn to value these little correspondences as proof, rather than dismissing them as coincidence. This is how the outer mirrors the inner, and when you graduate from ladders to larger aims, the protocol stays the same. Focus on the end state with sensory specificity and emotional completion. Do not script the means, because that narrows the intelligence that brings the result, and allow life to compose the how while you remain steady in the end you have assumed. This is where practice softens into knowing, and practical aids help. Keep a concise nightly record of the most vivid sensory bits. Use a single, repeatable scene to avoid scattering the subconscious with too many variations. And build a brief ritual of relaxation and focus that signals the mind. This is rehearsal for reality, not idle fantasy. This is the alchemy of feeling, and technically speaking, you seek a warm, settled conviction rather than feverish intensity. Invite gratitude into the scene, use breath and posture to embody completion, and let the emotion be quietly undeniable, so the deeper mind can no longer distinguish it from memory. This is how belief accrues weight, and when you worry that daytime contradictions will undo the work, understand that persistent imaginal acts slowly rewrite background assumptions. So each time a contrary thought surfaces, you simply return to the scene calmly and repeatedly until the new assumption becomes the silent default. This is the mountain-moving revelation, and the practical invitation I leave you with is precise and mercilessly simple. Try the ladder for 7 nights with sensory richness and journal the small echoes without forcing them to. This experiment will either prove to you that imagination holds creative authority, or it will expose the remaining, quietly held assumptions that need to be gently corrected so you can proceed to loftier, life-revising aims. Can you imagine a man who spoke with such calm certainty about invisible laws that his listeners left his lectures feeling as if the boundaries of possibility had been redrawn before their eyes? This is how his story begins. Not in fame, but in quiet observation, when Neville Goddard, a man born in Barbados in 1905, realized that the power shaping life was not circumstance, luck, or prayer to distant deities, but the imagination operating as the divine itself. This is where the veil thins, as we trace his journey from a young dancer in New York to a mystic whose teachings reached beyond denominations and dogma, offering proof that imagination, when felt as real, becomes the seed of manifestation. This is how a seeker becomes a teacher, because Neville didn't theorize, he practiced, experimented, and lived by the law he revealed. That consciousness is the only reality, and that what you assume to be true inwardly must externalize itself in due time. This is the moment the ordinary breaks, when Neville's own life transformed through the same methods he later shared with others, from military discharge by assumption to financial breakthroughs achieved through inner conviction rather than outer effort. This is where faith becomes science, because Neville was not appealing to blind belief but to demonstrable inner causation, urging his students to test his words instead of worship them, to treat imagination as laboratory rather than church. This is how identity begins to dissolve. For when you accept Neville's premise, you no longer see yourself as a limited creature striving to please an external power, but as that very power individualized, dreaming its world into shape with every sustained assumption. This is where philosophy meets evidence, as students began reporting results. The healed relationships, unexpected inheritances, sudden career leaps. Each one a living confirmation that imagination, when charged with feeling, rearranges matter itself. This is the turning point where teaching becomes awakening, because Neville's lectures were never meant to fill minds but to ignite remembrance, reminding each listener that what they called God was the creative awareness breathing through their own thought and feeling. This is how destiny refines itself. For once you glimpse that creation begins within, your struggles become less about forcing events and more about refining inner states, cultivating assumptions of peace, abundance, and love until they crystallize into fact. This is why Neville spoke with such paradoxical humility and authority, because he knew he was not preaching a personal philosophy, but interpreting a universal principle, the same one hidden in ancient scriptures and mystic traditions across ages, now stripped of ritual and made personal again. This is where old theology surrenders, as verses like, "I and my Father are one," or, "As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he," shed their ceremonial distance and reveal themselves as instructions for conscious creation rather than religious comfort. This is how the audience begins to stir, for his message sounds radical yet familiar, like a forgotten memory awakening, that to imagine is to create, to feel is to command, to assume is to give birth to form. This is where doubt begins to melt, not because Neville demands belief, but because he insists on experiment. Go home tonight, perform the act inwardly, feel it real, and watch what follows. And so faith is reborn as curiosity seasoned with proof. This is how the legend grows, through word of mouth, handwritten lecture notes, and recordings that carried his voice far beyond his lifetime, each one an echo reminding the world that creation begins not with effort, but with assumption. This is where his students become teachers, sharing results that ripple through decades, turning Neville from obscure mystic into a timeless mentor for seekers of practical spirituality in the digital age. This is how the law becomes personal again. For in understanding Neville, we recognize the thread connecting imagination, emotion, and manifestation, the unbroken current linking human thought to cosmic creation. This is where the unseen turns intimate, because Neville's every lesson pointed homeward, that the kingdom of heaven is within, that salvation is realization, and that imagination is the only bridge between the invisible and the visible. This is the subtle transformation his story inspires, as listeners move from studying his words to living them, replacing questions of if it's true with living demonstrations that show it cannot be otherwise. This is how the man becomes myth and method in one, Neville Goddard, the ordinary human who reminded generations that every image impressed upon the mind with conviction becomes destiny sculpted in matter, waiting only for your belief to bring it forth. Picture for a moment a crowded lecture hall in Los Angeles in the late 1940s, filled with people leaning forward in quiet anticipation as Neville Goddard steps onto the stage, his calm presence carrying the weight of something unseen yet profoundly real. This is how the experiment begins. Not with ritual or ceremony, but with a simple invitation that sounds almost absurd. To climb a ladder in your imagination every night until life proves to you that imagination commands the outer world. This is where curiosity overcomes reason. As Neville hands his students a paradox wrapped in practicality, he tells them to write on a card, "I will not climb a ladder," and place it where they will see it daily, yet instructs them to imagine climbing a ladder vividly before sleep. This is how the contradiction works its magic. Because the conscious mind, repeating, "I will not climb a ladder," resists, while the subconscious, fed by sensory imagination, accepts the climb as fact, setting in motion unseen currents that must eventually express themselves outwardly. This is where the first stirrings of faith are tested. For Neville warns them not to force the outer world to comply, but simply to observe, to treat it as a scientific experiment of the soul. This is how imagination becomes laboratory, and each student becomes both subject and scientist, discovering that belief is not passive hope but deliberate creation through inward experience made emotionally real. This is where resistance reveals itself, as some students scoff, others doubt, and still others attempt it out of idle curiosity. Yet beneath all skepticism lies the quiet question: what if it works? This is how subtle creation begins, through repetition and feeling, through the nightly rehearsal of gripping the rung, feeling its texture, sensing the body's rise and the faint thrill of ascent, until the line between imagined and actual begins to blur. This is where the invisible machinery of mind stirs, as the subconscious, obedient, impersonal, and creative, takes the inner event as done, mobilizing coincidences, opportunities, or literal ladders to satisfy the inner command. This is how proof takes form. When days later, without conscious planning, a student finds themselves fixing a light bulb, cleaning a shelf, or helping a friend, only to realize, mid-action, they are climbing a ladder exactly as imagined. This is where astonishment blooms, because the mind that once mocked the exercise now sees that imagination is not idle daydreaming, but a force that governs experience when disciplined and felt to be true. This is how Neville's genius reveals itself. For he chose an act without emotional charge, removing the bias of desire, allowing the principle itself, not the goal, to demonstrate its certainty. This is where principle triumphs over persuasion, and the students who once doubted return to his next lecture humbled, whispering of ladders that appeared in dreams, chores, and chance events, as if summoned by invisible design. This is how faith evolves from curiosity to conviction. For after such proof, one cannot easily return to the old belief that life is shaped from the outside in, rather than from the inside out. This is where the subtle revolution begins, as those who witness the experiment's success realize they hold the same power over every condition of life: money, health, relationships, waiting only for conscious direction through imagination. This is how Neville reframes creation, telling them the ladder was never about ladders, but about law, that everything, from ladders to legacies, follows the same inner process of assumption and acceptance. This is where simplicity hides profundity, for what seems like childlike imagination is in truth a divine operation clothed in play, testing one's ability to command the unseen through feeling and vision. This is how the world quietly shifts, because once even one person experiences proof of inner causation, their posture toward life changes. They walk lighter, speak with intention, and act from silent authority rather than fear. This is where the birth of the experiment becomes the birth of awakening itself. For Neville's challenge was never about proving him right, but about proving the creative power of imagination to each participant, a power that, once verified, forever transforms the way one perceives the world. Now consider this: the brilliance of Neville's design lay not in the image of the ladder itself, but in the psychological trap he set for the doubting mind. A deliberate contradiction meant to awaken awareness of how belief and imagination wrestle for dominion within us. This is how the paradox unfolds. For Neville instructed his audience to repeat, "I will not climb a ladder during the day," to write it on cards, to see it often, and to let their logical mind build a wall of denial, while at night, in stillness, they were to dissolve that wall by climbing a ladder in imagination with full sensory immersion. This is where the drama of consciousness begins, as the two selves, the reasoning conscious and the creative subconscious, move into tension, and the experiment becomes a mirror of the human condition itself. The outer self saying, "I cannot," and the inner self silently replying, "It is already done." This is how contradiction becomes creation, because the conscious mind, meant to guard the gates of logic, tires of its resistance, and in sleep or reverie, the deeper self begins to impress the inner image as law upon the fabric of reality. Is where the genius of Neville's method shines. For he knew that faith must be tested against doubt to reveal its true strength, and the phrase, "I will not climb the ladder," acts as resistance training for the imagination, giving it something to transcend. This is how the subconscious learns its dominance, because despite repeated denial, the feeling of climbing, the press of palms, the soft sway of balance, the heartbeat of ascent, slips past words and lodges in the mind that does not argue but creates. This is where magic hides behind method, for the act of feeling real without outer proof trains the student to trust the unseen process of manifestation, to stop begging circumstances for evidence and instead become the cause of them. This is how faith graduates into understanding, as the moment the ladder appears in waking life, through accident, need, or invitation, the student recognizes that imagination has triumphed over verbal denial, revealing the hierarchy of creation itself. This is where inner proof replaces outer persuasion. For once a person climbs a ladder they vowed they would not, no preacher, skeptic, or scientist can erase the inner knowing that consciousness alone commands experience. This is how the experiment dismantles superstition, because Neville was not appealing to mystical powers but to the lawful operations of the mind. The same mechanism that forms dreams, habits, and expectations, now consciously directed toward chosen ends. This is where the psychological duel transforms into spiritual discovery, as students realize the I that imagines is the same creative essence called God in ancient texts, and the denial of the conscious mind mirrors humanity's separation from its own power. This is how the paradox becomes revelation, for the experiment's true purpose was not proof of manifestation, but proof of identity. That the creative imagination within man is divine awareness testing itself in human form. This is where resistance becomes teacher, showing that every I can't in life is an invitation to contradict it through inner assumption, to hold the scene of fulfillment so vividly that the external world must yield its illusion of limitation. This is how mastery begins, when you realize that every obstacle, every contradiction, every voice of doubt is raw material for faith's refinement, sculpting certainty through deliberate inner feeling. This is where the ladder ceases to be an object and becomes a metaphor, a symbol for ascent from doubt to knowing, from intellect to experience, from separation to unity with the creative power that dreams worlds into being. This is how the experiment's simplicity hides its depth. For Neville was offering more than a lesson. He was offering a spiritual initiation disguised as play, a way to make contact with the creative current of consciousness itself. This is where students shift from curiosity to conviction, understanding that the I will not of the world can never stand against the I am of imagination once it feels something real within. This is how the paradox fulfills its secret mission. For every denial uttered by the conscious mind only feeds the certainty of the subconscious that the imagined act has already been lived and must therefore externalize itself in time. This is where the challenge transcends itself, because the true climb was never on a ladder but within the mind, run by run through belief, until at last the student stands atop the unseen structure of their own awakened awareness, gazing upon a world that now bends to imagination's command. Suppose you discover that the world outside is merely a reflection of the scenes you carry inside, and that the imagination is the lens through which reality is sculpted with precision and feeling. This is how the invisible becomes tangible. For Neville taught that every act of imagination, when felt as real, impresses the subconscious like ink on paper, and this impression eventually orchestrates events, coincidences, and circumstances in alignment with the inner blueprint. This is where subtle mastery begins, because the mind does not distinguish between memory and imagined experience. So a vividly felt scene carries the same authority as a remembered fact and prompts the subconscious to arrange the outer world to match it. This is how transformation quietly takes root, for repeated nightly enactment of an inner image strengthens its presence in the subconscious until doubt or outer circumstances cannot dislodge it, and the scene matures like a seed into full expression. This is where intention gains gravity, because the imagination must be paired with feeling, the emotional conviction of truth, without which the scene floats, ineffectual and weak, unable to shape reality into conformity with its imagined form. This is how everyday life becomes laboratory, as students learn to take neutral objects, like a ladder, and infuse them with detail, motion, and tactile experience, showing the creative mind that the substance of imagination alone is sufficient to mold experience. This is where evidence emerges in unexpected ways, when events occur that reflect the inner image without deliberate planning, confirming that the unseen accepts and manifests what is felt fully, leaving no room for chance to claim sole authorship. This is how the practitioner grows confident, realizing that imagination is not a pastime but a tool, a precise instrument capable of arranging people, places, and opportunities according to the scenes held with unwavering conviction. This is where sensation meets structure, for Neville emphasized that the inner scene should be immersive. See the ladder, hear its creak, feel the movement, sense the exertion, and let the bodily memory merge with mental image until distinction vanishes between imagined and actual. This is how doubt is neutralized, because once a scene is repeated with fidelity and emotional richness, the subconscious accepts it as fact, and the conscious mind's protests are rendered irrelevant. powerless against the inner certainty. This is where alignment accelerates, for the subconscious moves like gravity, drawing events, meetings, and synchronistic moments into the orbit dictated by the inner image, until outer life begins to resemble the blueprint first sketched within. This is how imagination asserts authority, as the student witnesses unplanned, verifiable occurrences that could not be predicted by reasoning alone, each one a confirmation that inner experience shapes outer reality more effectively than effort, persuasion, or struggle. This is where mastery becomes practical, because it teaches that imagination, not circumstance, is the true agent of change, and that by carefully crafting scenes and dwelling in them emotionally, one can sculpt life at will without violating natural laws. This is how the ordinary transforms, for the same process that moves ladders into waking life can move relationships, career advancements, wealth, and health, all of which respond to the feeling of fulfillment experienced internally long before the external form appears. This is where resistance becomes irrelevant, because the deeper mind only reads reality as already accomplished, and it orchestrates conditions to mirror what is firmly impressed within, regardless of disbelief or distraction in waking consciousness. This is how the spiritual and practical intersect, for Neville's method is both metaphysical and operational, showing that inner images are sacred scripts with tangible outcomes, making imagination both prayer and blueprint simultaneously. This is where learning is reinforced, as repeated nightly visualization with emotional immersion trains the mind to accept assumption as fact, and each succeeding day becomes a laboratory for testing the law in diverse areas of life. This is how perception reshapes itself, for students begin to see opportunities, connections, and coincidences where previously only randomness existed. Guided by the unconscious recognition of their own imagined realities is where empowerment takes hold, as one realizes that life is not a series of reactive events, but a mirror reflecting the scenes one chooses to inhabit mentally, and the latter becomes a symbol of ascent from passivity to conscious creation. This is how inner images wield real power, and by practicing detailed, emotionally charged scenes, one learns to bypass external limitation entirely, commanding circumstance from within, until every corner of life bends to the authority of imagination, felt as fact. Envision a world where each night before sleep becomes a laboratory of creation, a sacred rehearsal for the reality you desire, and the simple act of lying down transforms into a gateway of infinite possibility. This is how the nightly practice unfolds, as Neville instructed students to enter a state of relaxed awareness, release the chatter of the day, and allow the imagination to take full command, constructing scenes with such precision and tactile detail that the subconscious accepts them as lived reality. This is where attention is everything, because the slightest distraction can dilute the impression, while concentrated focus on textures, sounds, movements, and emotions saturates the subconscious, planting seeds that will inevitably grow into external events. This is how consistency compounds power, for repeated nightly enactment of a scene strengthens the inner impression, aligning desire, emotion, and imagination into a unified signal that the outer world is compelled to answer. This is where subtlety becomes the teacher, because Neville emphasized that forceful effort is unnecessary. The mind should be led gently into the experience, feeling the scene as real, letting the subconscious respond without coercion or anxiety. This is how sensory immersion works, as every detail matters. The feel of hands on a ladder rung, the creak underfoot, the sway of balance, the heartbeat, the tension and release, the light on the scene, and the sounds around, each element deepening the mind's conviction that the act is real and complete. This is where discipline intersects with faith, because the practice demands regularity without judgment, an experiment performed night after night, testing belief against inner experience until proof emerges naturally in waking life. This is how the mind differentiates between shallow fantasy and full assumption, for the subconscious only moves when the image is vivid, emotionally charged, and internally accepted as fact, not a fleeting daydream or abstract wish. This is where patience proves its value, as results rarely manifest instantly. The subconscious orchestrates the world according to its own timetable, creating the conditions, encounters, and opportunities that correspond to the scene impressed within. This is how expectation shifts subtly, from longing or hope to quiet knowing, because the practice teaches that fulfillment is internal first and external only second, and that imagination's authority is the true measure of reality. This is where habit becomes art. As nightly visualization develops into a ritual of conscious creation, a dance between mind and reality, in which every imagined act is treated as fact, unshaken by doubt or interruption. This is how ordinary moments are transformed, because when the scene is complete, it imprints itself so powerfully that it begins to echo in waking life, through coincidences, invitations, or literal enactments that confirm the inner blueprint. This is where empowerment consolidates, as students realize they are no longer passive observers but active creators, guiding the flow of life through deliberate inner experience, rather than reacting to external circumstances. This is how focus cultivates authority, because the act of nightly practice teaches that what you choose to inhabit internally will inevitably take shape externally, and the quality of attention is the currency of creation. This is where the subconscious learns its cues, responding only to the fidelity, consistency, and emotional intensity of the nightly scene, so that even the most skeptical student eventually witnesses events lining up with imagination's design. This is how the bridge between night and day strengthens, as students carry the sensation of completion into waking hours, allowing inner conviction to guide actions, decisions, and expectations effortlessly. This is where imagination's autonomy is revealed, for the deeper mind begins to orchestrate reality on its own, assembling circumstances in alignment with the felt scene, independent of conscious direction. This is how discipline becomes liberation, because once the nightly practice is internalized, one is freed from reliance on external validation, learning to trust the unseen creative intelligence within, and the outer world inevitably mirrors that trust. This is where proof takes root in simplicity, as seemingly minor events, a ladder appearing in an unexpected place, a coincidental encounter, a sudden opportunity, serve as irrefutable confirmation of the inner work's potency. This is how the cycle completes, for nightly practice establishes a rhythm of conscious creation, linking imagination, feeling, and reality into an unbroken flow, until the student becomes a living testament to Neville's principle that what is vividly assumed within must manifest without. Think of the moment when two minds seem to coexist within you: the reasoning conscious, skeptical and critical, and the creative subconscious, obedient and fertile, quietly recording every imaginal act as reality itself. This is how the trick reveals itself, for Neville designed the ladder exercise to deliberately create tension between these two facets. The conscious mind declares, "I will not climb the ladder," while the subconscious experiences the climb with full sensory engagement, accepting it as accomplished fact. This is where duality becomes demonstration, because the subconscious never argues or doubts. It registers what is felt internally and begins to orchestrate the outer world in alignment with that impression, regardless of the conscious mind's denials. This is how inner authority is tested, as the student witnesses the tension between thought and feeling, realizing that the mind that reasons does not rule the events of life. The deeper mind does, quietly and without debate. This is where the magic of Neville's method becomes apparent, for it teaches that the conscious mind's objections are immaterial, serving only as contrast to highlight the supremacy of sustained, felt imagination in shaping reality. This is how obedience of the subconscious works, because once a scene is impressed with clarity, texture, and emotional weight, it moves the machinery of life into correspondence, weaving circumstances, synchronicities, and opportunities that mirror the imagined experience. This is where patience aligns with power, as results may not appear instantly, yet the subconscious silently arranges conditions over time, producing outcomes that cannot be accounted for by chance or effort alone. This is how inner fidelity becomes the operative law, as repetition and consistency train the subconscious to accept certain outcomes as immutable, giving the student confidence that imagination, not circumstance, is the ultimate authority. This is where subtlety rules, because the subconscious responds to feeling, not logic. It obeys conviction, not argument, and delights in turning vivid internal acts into tangible manifestations. This is how contradiction proves principle, as the conscious mind resists, doubts, or even mocks the process, yet the subconscious, unfazed, continues to construct reality according to the scenes it has embraced as real. This is where revelation occurs, for students realize that the conscious mind is a commentator, while the subconscious is the architect, and mastery lies in feeding the subconscious with accurate, compelling internal evidence of the desired reality. This is how clarity becomes leverage, because the more precise the imagined act, the more faithfully the subconscious can reproduce its external counterpart, making sensory detail and emotional engagement the linchpins of effective creation. This is where empowerment deepens, as the student no longer seeks to convince the outside world, recognizing that inner acceptance alone is sufficient to summon alignment and proof. This is how discipline converges with freedom, because by faithfully rehearsing scenes with rich imagination and steady emotion, one frees life from the randomness of external conditions, allowing the unseen mind to orchestrate events effortlessly. This is where the interface of mind and matter becomes undeniable, as external confirmations, ladders, encounters, opportunities materialize in ways that challenge the authority of reason and highlight the law of assumption at work. This is how subtle mastery is maintained, where it relies not on controlling events, but on controlling inner states, feeding the subconscious with unwaveringly vivid and felt impressions of the desired outcome. This is where resilience is forged, because repeated interaction with inner and outer tension teaches the student to remain anchored in the assumed reality, indifferent to fleeting doubts, interruptions, or contradictions in waking life. This is how the bridge between imagination and manifestation is crossed, by letting the subconscious guide reality, while the conscious mind observes, marvels, and gradually learns to trust in unseen processes. This is where the principle scales, for the same method that manifests a ladder can manifest relationships, wealth, health, and opportunity, as the subconscious applies its obedient mechanism to any scene held with sufficient clarity and emotion. This is how life becomes a mirror of internal fidelity, reflecting exactly what the subconscious believes, and demonstrating that conscious disbelief, though persistent, cannot override the power of felt assumption. This is where the student ultimately awakens to creative authority, understanding that mastery lies not in effort or external persuasion, but in impressing the inner mind with precise, emotionally real images, letting the deeper mind craft the outer world in seamless correspondence with inner truth. Ask yourself what happens when ordinary people are confronted with extraordinary possibility. The first students of Neville Goddard were a mix of skepticism, curiosity, and quiet hope, each responding in a way that revealed both the potency of imagination and the limitations of habitual belief. This is how disbelief meets evidence, because some laughed outright at the idea of imagining a ladder and writing, "I will not climb a ladder," while performing the act nightly, dismissing it as childish, abstract, or fanciful, while others quietly followed instructions, sensing an inner truth too subtle for immediate articulation. This is where surprise begins to stir, for even the most doubtful participants began noticing small correspondences. A ladder appearing on a worksite, a chore that required climbing, a dream that replicated the imagined act with uncanny precision, each occurrence forcing a reconsideration of what was possible when imagination was engaged with feeling and consistency. This is how proof erodes resistance, because the external confirmations could not be explained by coincidence alone, and the skeptical mind, confronted with repeated manifestations, had no choice but to acknowledge the authority of the subconscious and the reality of the law being demonstrated. This is where curiosity blooms, as students who initially participated half-heartedly began refining their practice, investing more attention, more sensory detail, more emotion into their nightly visualizations, learning that the richer the inner scene, the more compelling its manifestation in waking life. This is how transformation begins quietly, in small, almost imperceptible shifts. An unexpected promotion, a meeting arranged seemingly by chance, a ladder incident appearing in mundane routines, all pointing to an unseen law at work, challenging students to expand their understanding of what is possible. This is where skepticism is softened, because the evidence accumulates incrementally, leaving no dramatic moment of conversion, only a steady awareness that imagination, when vividly assumed, reshapes circumstance. This is how belief gains traction, for those early experiences serve as irrefutable feedback, teaching that the inner scene, once impressed upon the subconscious, is more reliable than any external plan, suggestion, or circumstance. This is where wonder awakens, as students realize that even the most ordinary objects and routines, the ladder, the doorway, a street corner, can become instruments of proof, reinforcing the law of assumption in ways that are both mundane and miraculous. This is how Neville's teachings take root, because the method is self-verifying. The more faithfully a student follows the nightly practice, the more undeniable the evidence becomes, allowing theory to be replaced with lived reality. This is where confidence builds, as repeated success, even in small things, reinforces the student's trust in imagination as a creative power that operates independently of conscious interference or external validation. This is how empowerment takes hold, for students begin to experiment beyond ladders, applying the principle to money, relationships, and personal goals. Testing the law in broader contexts once they've witnessed its reliability in the simple exercise. This is where resistance continues to provide opportunity, because challenges and unexpected contradictions force the practitioner to deepen emotional conviction, refine the clarity of inner images, and maintain faith in the unseen orchestration of life. This is how subtle discernment develops, as students learn to differentiate between fleeting fantasies and fully assumed inner scenes, understanding that the subconscious obeys only what is felt and experienced as already true. This is where the wonder of synchronicity becomes palpable, as seemingly unrelated events converge to validate inner assumptions, teaching the student that imagination not only guides life, but coordinates its details with intelligence and precision beyond conscious calculation. This is how patience is reinforced, because manifestations often arrive in forms unexpected, requiring the practitioner to remain steadfast and attentive, honoring the slow, unseen work of the subconscious. This is where practical learning merges with spiritual insight, for each manifestation, ladder-related or otherwise, becomes a teaching moment, revealing the mechanics of consciousness and the omnipotence of felt imagination. This is how the law of assumption becomes real, transforming students from casual experimenters into active participants in their own creative process, witnessing firsthand that internal experience dictates external reality. This is where anticipation sharpens, as every new attempt carries the possibility of discovery, confirmation, and surprise, encouraging consistent practice and faithful engagement with the inner scene. This is how the early reactions, from laughter to astonishment, serve not merely as anecdotal evidence, but as living demonstrations of a principle that will continue to shape consciousness and reality for anyone willing to engage it with precision, feeling, and unwavering attention. Envision a scene where the imagination, once nurtured and felt as real, begins to ripple outward, producing tangible results in ways both subtle and undeniable, and the student realizes that inner rehearsal carries inevitable consequences. This is how manifestation first announces itself, often unexpectedly. A ladder appears in a dream, a task arises requiring one to climb, or a chance event mirrors the imagined scenario so precisely that the mind is forced to recognize the unseen hand of consciousness at work. This is where astonishment transforms into understanding, for the repetition of nightly practice has created a momentum that the outer world cannot resist, revealing that what was vivid within must materialize without. This is how proof consolidates, because students witness events that defy coincidence. Moments where imagined action and lived reality converge, and a quiet, unshakable conviction forms that imagination is the law, and the law is exact. This is where internal belief strengthens, as the student notes small confirmations each day, a visual cue, a conversation, an unexpected encounter, all corresponding to the scene rehearsed with emotional precision. This is how awareness expands, teaching that manifestation is not always literal, but symbolic, and the outer world often delivers evidence in ways tailored to consciousness, reinforcing trust without needing spectacle. This is where patience is validated, for manifestations rarely follow a strict timetable, and the delay tests faith, requiring the practitioner to remain anchored in assumption even when external proof lags behind internal certainty. This is how subtlety becomes revelation, because every sign, every synchronicity, every minor echo of the imagined ladder indicates that the subconscious is orchestrating events with intelligence and precision beyond conscious calculation. This is where excitement is tempered with discipline. As the student learns not to chase results or manipulate circumstances, but to hold the inner scene with unwavering feeling, knowing that manifestation will follow its own path and schedule. This is how the principle scales, demonstrating that the same method that produces a ladder in waking life can orchestrate wealth, relationships, health, and success when the inner scene is equally vivid and emotionally complete. This is where inner authority asserts itself, as students realize they do not need external approval, validation, or explanation. Their imagination, once firmly assumed, is sufficient to move the world into alignment. This is how the law of assumption asserts supremacy. For repeated proof builds an intuitive understanding that consciousness is the source of all creation, and outer circumstances are malleable reflections of inner certainty. This is where gratitude amplifies manifestation, because students who dwell in the feeling of fulfillment, rather than in longing or expectation, accelerate the alignment between inner scene and outer reality, producing outcomes more quickly and effortlessly. This is how clarity and specificity govern creation, as each imagined detail, texture, sound, motion, and emotion, directly shapes the fidelity of the manifested experience, teaching the importance of precision in internal rehearsal. This is where the emotional body leads the conscious mind, for the heart's conviction of completion guides the subconscious more powerfully than reason, and life responds to the feeling of already having, rather than the intellectual desire for acquisition. This is how synchronicity becomes commonplace, as seemingly unrelated events coalesce to confirm the inner assumption, demonstrating the intelligent responsiveness of the subconscious to focused imagination. This is where faith transforms into knowing, for after repeated manifestations, doubt loses its grip, replaced by experiential certainty that imagination, when felt as real, is the sovereign power shaping circumstance. This is how subtle mastery emerges, as students learn to cultivate inner scenes for increasingly complex desires, knowing that what is constructed within will find expression outside, regardless of current conditions. This is where empowerment takes root, as the practitioner experiences firsthand that external limitations are illusory, and the ability to create resides entirely in the fidelity and intensity of inner experience. This is how the moment of manifestation crystallizes Neville's teaching into living reality, converting imagination from theory into undeniable law, and transforming the student from observer to conscious architect of life itself. Can you imagine that a simple wooden ladder could teach humanity one of the deepest truths about creation and consciousness, serving as both tool and metaphor for awakening to inner power? This is how the lesson unfolds, because Neville Goddard never intended the ladder itself to be the goal. The exercise was designed to prove that imagination, when vividly assumed and felt as real, shapes the outer world according to the law of assumption. This is where subtlety becomes teaching, for the ladder is neutral, emotionally uncharged, and easily recognized, allowing the student to focus purely on the mechanics of inner creation, rather than being distracted by desire for a specific outcome. This is how principle is revealed, as the true aim is to demonstrate that the mind, not circumstance, is the ultimate architect, and that external reality bends to the impressed and sustained imaginal act. This is where insight deepens, because the paradoxical instruction, to deny climbing the ladder while performing it mentally, exposes the separation between the reasoning conscious mind and the creative subconscious, highlighting which truly governs the material world. This is how understanding solidifies, as students witness manifestations that cannot be explained by effort, planning, or coincidence, learning that inner assumption, felt with emotion, is sufficient to initiate change. This is where the symbolic value of the ladder emerges, representing ascent from limitation, doubt, and dependency on external conditions to the realization of self-mastery, authority, and creative freedom within consciousness. This is how imagination becomes a laboratory, Because by experimenting with a simple act, students gain tangible experience of a law that applies universally to all goals, desires, and circumstances, no matter how complex or significant. This is where the teaching moves from theory to practice. For observing the ladder manifest externally or in subtle synchronistic ways confirms that sustained inner conviction is the bridge between desire and reality, transforming abstract law into concrete proof. This is how faith is tested, as the conscious mind may resist, dismiss, or question, yet the subconscious, impressed by detail and feeling, silently orchestrates events in alignment with what has been assumed internally. This is where discipline meets revelation. For repeated nightly practice cultivates not just skill, but also understanding of the inner workings of consciousness, showing that patience, consistency, and sensory fidelity are the key drivers of manifestation. This is how empowerment becomes experiential, because once a student sees the ladder appear in some form, they recognize that limitations are largely mental constructs, and that imagination, properly applied, is the true source of power in life. This is where the ladder's lesson radiates outward, teaching that external forms are secondary. The inner scene is the blueprint, and outer events are merely reflections of what is firmly impressed in mind and felt as real. This is how subtle mastery is reinforced, as the repeated paradox. The ladder imagined while consciously denied strengthens awareness of the distinction between egoic reasoning and the obedient, creative power of the subconscious. This is where clarity of method matters, because the exercise requires not fanciful daydreaming, but vivid, emotionally charged imagination, demonstrating that detail, feeling, and assumption are the levers by which reality is influenced. This is how the mind learns its law, as repeated practice trains both the conscious and subconscious to recognize which experiences are formative, creating a seamless conduit for intention to translate into external effect. This is where belief solidifies. For seeing proof in small manifestations builds unshakable confidence that the unseen mind is the primary agent of change, capable of shaping life in accordance with internal fidelity. This is how inner freedom is cultivated, because students discover that their external circumstances are not rulers of possibility, but mirrors, responding directly to the quality and intensity of inner assumption. This is where the ladder transcends its form, becoming a metaphor for all desires. Climb within first, feel the completion, and the world will follow, regardless of initial skepticism, limitation, or resistance. This is how Neville's ultimate teaching is delivered, through simple, elegant, paradoxical exercises that reveal the immense creative authority of the imagination when felt as real and sustained with patience and precision. This is where the seed of conscious creation is planted. For the latter, though ordinary in appearance, is a doorway to extraordinary understanding. That mastery of imagination equals mastery of life itself. Picture for a moment that the key to reshaping your entire life lies not in external effort, planning, or struggle, but in the simple yet profound act of assuming the feeling of your desire already fulfilled. And that assumption alone is the invisible lever moving mountains in your reality. This is how the law of assumption unfolds, as Neville Goddard taught that whatever you persistently assume to be true in your imagination becomes your experience. Because the subconscious does not distinguish between actual events and vividly felt internal realities. This is where mastery begins, because the mind, once impressed with the assumption, begins to orchestrate circumstances, opportunities, and encounters that correspond perfectly to the inner conviction, bypassing resistance, doubt, or apparent limitations. This is how belief crystallizes, as repeated imaginal acts, coupled with feeling, overwrite prior assumptions of lack, scarcity, or limitation, embedding new truths into the subconscious and establishing a blueprint for external manifestation. This is where imagination asserts sovereignty, for the outer world inevitably mirrors the inner state, reflecting exactly what has been assumed with consistent emotion and attention, leaving no room for randomness to override deliberate creation. This is how students learn precision, because vague or uncertain assumptions produce inconsistent results, teaching that specificity in the felt scene, details, sensations, and emotional resonance is critical for exacting manifestations. This is where empowerment takes root, as practitioners recognize that they are not passive observers of life, but conscious architects, capable of rewriting reality by simply living from the assumption of fulfillment rather than hoping for change. This is how alignment accelerates, because the subconscious, obedient to assumption, organizes conditions to match the internal state, sometimes in unexpected forms, yet always faithful to the essence of the imagined reality. This is where subtlety matters, for the law of assumption is not a formula to be forced, but a principle to be trusted, requiring consistent rehearsal, emotional immersion, and an unwavering inner conviction that the desired state is already real. This is how patience becomes strategic, as manifestation does not adhere to external schedules. The subconscious works tirelessly, aligning events, people, and situations in perfect timing to reflect the assumed state, even if the conscious mind cannot immediately perceive it. This is where practical application emerges, because once students grasp the law, they can move from the ladder exercise to imagining wealth, relationships, health, or success, holding each scene internally with emotional completeness until life yields corresponding results. This is how doubt is neutralized, for repeated confirmation through manifestation teaches that the inner conviction, once properly established, is invincible, and the conscious mind's objections lose authority over outcomes. This is where imagination becomes sovereign, as practitioners realize that every circumstance is responsive to internal states, and the quality of assumption, not external effort, governs the unfolding of experience. This is how the law is universal, applying equally to trivial events and life-altering desires, revealing that consciousness is the single, unerring determinant of reality, and external appearances are merely reflections of inner beliefs. This is where focus sharpens, as students learn to cultivate single, vivid assumptions rather than scattering attention across competing desires, ensuring that the subconscious receives a clear, potent directive for manifestation. This is how subtlety transforms practice, because feelings must precede facts, and the emotional experience of fulfillment is the true signal that the subconscious reads and obeys. This is where empowerment solidifies, for understanding that reality bends to assumption eliminates reliance on external forces, teaching that control resides not in manipulation of circumstances, but in mastery of inner state and sustained belief. This is how expansion occurs, as students begin to apply the law to all areas of life, testing it on health, abundance, relationships, and opportunity, and witnessing the seamless translation of inner assumptions into outer fact. This is where Neville's teaching resonates across time, for the law of assumption is simple yet profound. Persistently assume your desire fulfilled, feel it real, and allow the subconscious to orchestrate the world accordingly, turning imagination into undeniable reality. Envision the immense subtlety of life, where feeling is not merely an accompaniment to thought, but the driving force that converts imagination into reality, acting as the unseen currency of creation. This is how Neville Goddard emphasized the primacy of emotion, teaching that thought alone, without the accompanying feeling of truth and completion, lacks the power to impress the subconscious and bring about tangible results. This is where the ladder exercise illustrates the principle, because climbing a ladder in imagination with neutral desire is only effective when the act is imbued with full sensory experience and conviction, making the subconscious accept it as done. This is how feeling becomes the liver of manifestation, as the intensity, clarity, and authenticity of the emotion attached to an imagined scene dictate the speed and fidelity with which the outer world aligns to the inner blueprint. This is where mastery refines itself, for students quickly learn that without feeling, images are inert. They float as fantasies, unable to compel external evidence, and repeated failure points them back to emotional depth as the missing ingredient. This is how the subconscious is instructed, because it reads emotional reality, not intellectual argument. And once a scene is experienced with genuine feeling, it mobilizes the unseen forces of life to bring circumstances into accordance with that felt reality. This is where patience intersects with power, as the practitioner must hold the feeling steady, consistently reinforcing it nightly until the subconscious integrates it as absolute fact, creating momentum that the outer world cannot resist. This is how the law of assumption is activated, because feeling is the ignition that sparks the inner assumption into motion, transforming abstract imagination into living events, coincidences, and opportunities that align perfectly with internal experience. This is where subtlety teaches discipline, for the practitioner must cultivate a calm, unwavering sense of fulfillment without clinging to the outer result. Understanding that the intensity of internal conviction, not force or worry, compels manifestation. This is how inner authority strengthens, because repeated emotional rehearsal demonstrates to the student that the world responds not to desire alone, but to the qualitative experience of fulfillment already assumed within. This is where awareness deepens, as students recognize that feelings carry creative power independent of circumstance, and that their emotional state is the primary determinant of events, relationships, and outcomes in daily life. This is how focus becomes essential, because scattering attention or weakly feeling a scene dilutes its creative potency, whereas a singular, fully embodied inner act impresses the subconscious with authority and certainty. This is where the ladder metaphor extends, as each rung climbed in imagination mirrors the ascent of feeling mastery. The higher the fidelity of emotional experience, the closer the inner assumption comes to external manifestation. This is how synchronicity emerges, as subtle alignment occurs naturally, producing external signs, events, or encounters that correspond with the internal scene, confirming the effectiveness of sustained emotional engagement. This is where empowerment deepens, for students realize that life is not dictated by circumstance, chance, or effort, but by the quality and intensity of the feelings they cultivate and maintain internally. This is how subtle mastery becomes habitual, as nightly rehearsal of vivid, emotionally complete scenes trains the subconscious to accept assumptions as fact, and outer reality begins to reflect internal fidelity with increasing accuracy. This is where patience and trust converge, as the practitioner learns to maintain the feeling of completion without forcing the outer manifestation, knowing that the unseen mind operates according to its own perfect timing. This is how the emotional body becomes the vehicle of creation, guiding circumstances, decisions, and opportunities in accordance with the inner state, demonstrating that feeling is not optional but essential in conscious manifestation. This is where the student transforms, moving from intellectual curiosity to experiential certainty, for repeated practice shows that feeling is the key that unlocks the door between imagination and tangible reality, making every assumed scene a law unto itself. This is how Neville's teaching resonates profoundly, revealing that emotion is the indispensable element in creation, the silent agent by which imagination shapes existence, and the inner state of feeling is the truest measure of one's ability to command life itself. Consider the possibility that within you exists a mind so powerful and obedient that it reshapes every detail of your life according to the images and feelings you impress upon it, acting with absolute loyalty to your inner assumption. This is how Neville Goddard illuminated the role of the subconscious, describing it as a faithful servant that executes the commands of imagination without judgment, hesitation, or discrimination, taking every vividly felt scene as law to be realized in experience. This is where obedience becomes miraculous, because the subconscious does not question the plausibility of your desires. It simply arranges circumstances to match the internal reality it has accepted as true, whether the conscious mind believes it or not. This is how authority is recognized, for the practitioner quickly discovers that the deeper mind governs outcomes far more decisively than conscious reasoning, and mastery lies in learning to impress it accurately and consistently. This is where subtlety teaches control, because the subconscious responds not to effort, force, or persuasion, but to clarity, feeling, and repetition, making precise, emotionally rich imagination the only effective means of creation. This is how confidence develops, as repeated success through subconscious cooperation demonstrates that external limitations are illusory and that the inner mind alone directs reality's unfolding. This is where patience becomes practice, as manifestations may follow a timetable known only to the subconscious, requiring the student to maintain assumption without forcing events or succumbing to doubt or anxiety. This is how refinement occurs, because the practitioner learns to feed the subconscious only what is desired, carefully avoiding contradictory thoughts or feelings that might dilute the intended outcome, recognizing that this unseen mind cannot be tricked, only guided with fidelity. This is where alignment strengthens. For every imaginal act impressed with sensory detail and emotional conviction tunes the subconscious to orchestrate people, circumstances, and opportunities in perfect correspondence with inner reality. This is how trust is built, as the student observes events unfolding with precision, reinforcing the understanding that the subconscious, when properly impressed, works tirelessly to translate inner assumption into outer manifestation. This is where subtle mastery grows, because success is not contingent on manipulating external conditions, but on consistently impressing the desired scene with full awareness and emotional resonance. This is how the bridge between thought and reality is constructed, as the subconscious interprets imagination as fact and sets into motion the mechanisms of life to fulfill it, turning inner certainty into external proof. This is where empowerment solidifies, for knowing that the subconscious faithfully executes assumptions frees the practitioner from reliance on effort, planning, or persuasion, revealing that inner state is the ultimate determinant of experience. This is how precision becomes essential, because careless or conflicting imagery produces inconsistent results, while disciplined, emotionally charged scenes generate reliable manifestations, demonstrating the exactness of subconscious obedience. This is where subtle signals guide action, as the subconscious may arrange outer events in symbolic or indirect ways, requiring the practitioner to remain observant, patient, and attuned to synchronicities that confirm internal assumption is active. This is how independence is cultivated, because mastery of the subconscious teaches that the world is malleable, responsive, and ultimately governed by internal fidelity rather than external circumstance, making inner practice the source of all change. This is where imagination and subconscious merge, as repeated, emotionally complete assumptions train the unseen mind to act as an extension of conscious intention, producing outcomes with precision and inevitability. This is how consistent alignment produces reliability, as the student experiences a seamless translation from imagined scene to realized event, affirming Neville's teaching that the subconscious obeys unerringly when correctly impressed. This is where freedom is realized, for understanding that the subconscious is a loyal servant of imagination allows the practitioner to act with authority, patience, and trust, knowing that life is perpetually responding to inner fidelity rather than external coercion. This is how Neville's vision comes alive, demonstrating that conscious creation is possible once the subconscious is recognized, respected, and impressed with vivid emotionally charged assumption, making it the ultimate agent of transformation in one's life. Ask yourself what happens when the mind encounters resistance from both within and without, the skepticism of the conscious self and the contradictory pressures of external circumstance, and how Neville Goddard's ladder technique provides a path to transcend these obstacles. This is how doubt and resistance are confronted. For Neville taught that they are not enemies but signals, indicators of where inner conviction must be strengthened and where attention must be refocused on the felt reality of the desired outcome. This is where inner discipline becomes crucial, because the conscious mind naturally questions, doubts, and rationalizes. Yet the subconscious obeys only what is assumed and felt as real, requiring the student to cultivate unwavering emotional certainty. This is how the paradox works, as students are instructed to consciously deny the act while imaginatively performing it with full immersion, creating tension that exposes the areas where inner resistance resides and where faith must be exercised. This is where patience and persistence shine, because manifestations are rarely instantaneous, and the conscious mind often interprets delays as failure, while the subconscious quietly arranges circumstances in alignment with the inner scene on its own perfect timetable. This is how trust is forged, as repeated success in spite of doubt teaches that outer appearances are secondary, and that the inner state governs the unfolding of life with perfect intelligence and timing. This is where subtle mastery is developed, for overcoming resistance requires not force, but calm, persistent focus on the inner reality, allowing imagination and feeling to override the skeptical chatter of the conscious mind. This is how emotional calibration matters, because the intensity and authenticity of feeling determine the speed and fidelity of manifestation, and doubt weakens the signal, whereas unwavering emotional experience strengthens it, compelling the subconscious to act. This is where visualization becomes a tool for transformation. As students learn to immerse themselves fully in the scene, experiencing every sensory detail and emotion, thereby neutralizing inner resistance and impressing the subconscious with unshakable certainty. This is how awareness of inner power grows, as the student recognizes that obstacles are not external truths, but reflections of unassumed or half-hearted internal states, revealing areas where belief must be clarified and reinforced. This is where the ladder metaphor teaches resilience, because each rung climbed in imagination represents a step beyond doubt, a conscious choice to prioritize felt reality over skepticism, demonstrating that persistence in inner assumption is stronger than any apparent external limitation. This is how faith is exercised. For the conscious mind may protest, the environment may seem uncooperative, yet the student learns to maintain the inner scene with conviction, trusting that the subconscious orchestrates everything to fulfill the assumed reality. This is where subtle alignment occurs, as overcoming resistance allows the inner and outer worlds to synchronize, with events, opportunities, and people naturally corresponding to the imagined scenario without forced effort. This is how clarity and focus sharpen, because every distraction or wavering thought is recognized as a signal to return attention to the vividly felt scene, reinforcing inner authority and diminishing the influence of doubt. This is where empowerment is internalized. For students understand that the law of assumption cannot fail when assumptions are emotionally complete, and that resistance is merely a temporary test of fidelity rather than a barrier to creation. This is how mastery is reinforced, as consistent practice strengthens the ability to hold desired states despite contrary appearances, demonstrating that inner conviction is more powerful than the fluctuating evidence of the senses. This is where patience merges with confidence, as practitioners learn that the subconscious operates with perfect timing, and the visible manifestation is the inevitable reflection of internal assumption rather than an urgent, pressured task. This is how life becomes a laboratory for refining faith, as each encounter with resistance offers the opportunity to deepen inner feeling, perfect imagination, and strengthen trust in the unseen mechanisms of creation. This is where the student's perception shifts, realizing that doubt and resistance are not threats but instruments for refining focus, sharpening emotional clarity, and reinforcing the primacy of the inner scene over outer circumstance. This is how Neville's teaching empowers, showing that the only real obstacle is hesitation within, and that by maintaining vivid, emotionally complete assumptions, one can bypass all outer limitations and allow the subconscious to manifest desires flawlessly and effortlessly. This is where transformation solidifies, as the student experiences firsthand that overcoming doubt is not a matter of convincing the world, but of convincing the mind, proving that persistent, felt imagination is the ultimate creative authority. Envision a world where the ladder is no longer just a physical object, but a gateway to understanding that every desire, goal, and aspiration follows the same principle of imaginative assumption, and that the mind holds the power to orchestrate all outcomes with precision and fidelity. This is how Neville Goddard extended the lesson, teaching that once the law of assumption is experienced through a simple ladder exercise, it can be applied to wealth, relationships, health, and life's greatest ambitions, because the mechanism of creation is universal and consistent. This is where imagination scales, for the same process that moves a ladder into reality can orchestrate complex events and synchronize people, circumstances, and opportunities to align with deeply felt inner scenes. This is how confidence grows, as students realize that mastery of imagination is not limited to trivial exercises, but is the key to consciously directing the entire flow of life, shaping events according to the inner blueprint they maintain with conviction and feeling. This is where subtlety becomes essential, because while the principle is simple, its application requires precision. Each desired outcome must be imagined in sensory detail, fully felt emotionally, and assumed to be complete in order to engage the subconscious effectively. This is how mastery deepens, as the student learns to move beyond external constraints, relying not on effort, persuasion, or circumstance, but on the fidelity of internal experience to generate results that appear effortlessly in the external world. This is where synchronicity flourishes, because when multiple desires are impressed upon the subconscious with clarity and feeling, events begin to converge in harmonious alignment, producing opportunities and coincidences that seem miraculous, yet are entirely consistent with internal assumption. This is how the ladder becomes symbolic, representing the ascent from limitation, doubt, and external dependence to full creative sovereignty, reminding the practitioner that all manifestations, large or small, follow the same invisible law. This is where patience and timing are revealed as allies, because complex manifestations may take longer to appear, requiring steady faith and sustained emotional engagement, while the subconscious orchestrates circumstances to reflect the assumed reality perfectly. This is how trust is cemented, as repeated success across multiple areas of life demonstrates that imagination, not circumstance, is the determining force, reinforcing the understanding that internal conviction is more reliable than outer evidence. This is where empowerment becomes habitual, as students learn to consistently inhabit their desired states, allowing the subconscious to translate vivid assumption into tangible outcomes, producing results that seem effortless and inevitable. This is how creativity is unleashed, because once the mind understands its power, the student begins to imagine boldly, exploring scenarios previously thought impossible and witnessing their inner assumptions ripple into existence with remarkable fidelity. This is where refinement occurs, as repeated practice teaches how to fine-tune imagination, emotional intensity, and focus to achieve increasingly complex manifestations without strain, forcing, or attachment to specific forms. This is how responsibility is recognized, because the practitioner understands that conscious creation requires careful attention to internal states, knowing that each thought, feeling, and assumption shapes life with precision and authority. This is where integration emerges, as the latter exercise becomes a foundational tool for daily life, reminding the student that every imagined scene, when fully felt, operates as a blueprint for reality, influencing both minor events and life-altering circumstances. This is how expansion teaches subtlety, as the mind learns to prioritize emotional fidelity over obsessive desire, cultivating a sense of completion and satisfaction internally, which naturally attracts external proof without effort or struggle. This is where the subconscious asserts its reliability, for as the practitioner applies the law to diverse goals, the unseen mind continues to orchestrate events, demonstrating that internal assumption is universally effective, regardless of complexity or scale. This is how wisdom is internalized, as repeated application of the principle builds intuitive understanding, allowing the student to know without question that what is vividly imagined and felt is always destined to manifest. This is where courage is cultivated, for applying the law to larger desires requires the practitioner to trust the unseen, relinquish doubt, and boldly assume outcomes that may seem improbable externally, but are certain internally. This is how mastery manifests, as imagination, emotion, and assumption converge into seamless creation, demonstrating that life can be shaped deliberately through sustained inner fidelity, and that external limitations are ultimately illusions. This is where Neville's teaching transcends exercises, showing that the latter is merely a stepping stone to full awareness. Once one knows the power of assumption, every aspect of life can be consciously designed, proving that imagination, when felt as real, is the architect of all experience. Think of the ordinary routines of your day transformed into opportunities for conscious creation, where imagination is not a pastime, but the primary tool shaping reality, and every thought and feeling carries the potential to influence events with precision and authority. This is how Neville Goddard integrated imagination into daily life, teaching that the mind should be used deliberately to construct desired experiences in small and large ways, from minor interactions to major life goals, because consistent inner assumption impresses the subconscious and produces corresponding outer realities. This is where ordinary actions become extraordinary, as students learn to mentally rehearse events before they occur, visualizing outcomes with sensory detail and emotional fidelity, knowing that the subconscious will orchestrate circumstances to match the inner scene. This is how attention to detail matters, because subtle elements, the tone of voice, the gestures, the surroundings, the sensory environment, strengthen the impression on the subconscious, increasing the accuracy and speed of manifestation. This is where persistence becomes key, as daily repetition of imagined scenes embeds assumption deeply within the subconscious, turning it into a reliable agent of creation that operates without conscious effort or awareness. This is how external circumstances are reframed, because students learn that obstacles are not limits but signals, highlighting areas where inner clarity, belief, or emotional intensity need to be strengthened for effective manifestation. This is where flexibility is developed, as imagination allows students to explore multiple scenarios and approaches internally, testing outcomes safely in the mind before acting in the world, creating a natural alignment between internal design and external reality. This is how timing becomes intuitive, for the subconscious coordinates events in ways that are often unexpected yet perfectly suited to the imagined scenario, teaching patience and trust in the unseen orchestration of life. This is where empowerment expands, because conscious rehearsal in daily life reinforces the understanding that the outer world is responsive, reflecting the fidelity and completeness of internal experience rather than external circumstance or effort. This is how refinement occurs, as the student learns to distinguish between fleeting daydreams and fully assumed, emotionally real inner scenes that command the subconscious and generate tangible results. This is where subtle mastery emerges, for even routine interactions, conversations, decisions, tasks can be guided by imagination, turning mundane life into a continuous laboratory for conscious creation and aligning external events with internal intention. This is how alignment strengthens, because consistent focus on assumed realities trains the subconscious to prioritize what is felt as true, creating a seamless connection between inner vision and outer manifestation, allowing life to flow effortlessly toward desired outcomes. This is where trust in the unseen is cultivated, as repeated confirmation of small manifestations reinforces the reliability of internal assumption, making faith in imaginative power habitual and instinctive. This is how clarity and precision sharpen, as students learn to hold scenes with exact sensory detail, emotional richness, and completeness, knowing that the subconscious responds most powerfully to vivid, coherent images experienced as already real. This is where discipline merges with creativity, for applying imagination in daily life requires both structured practice and flexibility of vision, allowing the mind to craft experiences that are authentic, resonant, and deeply felt. This is how responsibility is embraced, because students realize that every inner act, thought, and feeling carries creative weight, teaching that conscious use of imagination is the ultimate determinant of life outcomes. This is where subtlety teaches patience, as manifestations unfold according to the subconscious's orchestration, often appearing gradually, requiring the practitioner to remain anchored in assumed reality without clinging or forcing outcomes. This is how empowerment consolidates, as life becomes increasingly responsive to inner states, and external circumstances cease to intimidate or dictate, reflecting instead the consistency, fidelity, and intensity of imagined experience. This is where imagination becomes a living tool, shaping not only events but attitudes, perceptions, and relationships, creating a world that mirrors internal mastery and emotional conviction. This is how the student's awareness expands, understanding that conscious imagination is not separate from life, but deeply embedded in every moment, turning routine days into opportunities for deliberate creation and continuous alignment with desired realities. This is where Neville's teaching proves timeless, revealing that the law of assumption functions constantly and universally, and that the deliberate use of imagination in daily life transforms the ordinary into a canvas for conscious, effortless creation. Now consider this. The secret to mastery lies not in sporadic effort, but in the relentless, consistent practice of imagining and feeling desired outcomes as already real, night after night and day after day, until the subconscious is fully convinced of their truth. This is how Neville Goddard emphasized persistence, teaching that repeated, emotionally vivid assumption creates a momentum within the subconscious that cannot be undone by fleeting doubts, external circumstances, or contrary opinions. This is where results solidify, for manifestations often require cumulative reinforcement, and each rehearsal of the inner scene strengthens the imprint, aligning life with imagined reality with increasing fidelity and speed. This is how subtle power accumulates as the mind learns to trust its own creative authority, knowing that consistency in feeling and imagination gradually overcomes internal resistance and external uncertainty, producing undeniable proof of law in action. This is where discipline becomes freedom, because by faithfully rehearsing scenes daily, the practitioner shifts from hoping for results to knowing them, releasing anxiety and struggle, and allowing the subconscious to orchestrate events effortlessly. This is how reliability is cultivated, as repeated inner practice creates predictable responses from the unseen mind, demonstrating that persistence, not chance or external manipulation, is the true driver of creation. This is where resilience is forged, because setbacks or delays are reframed not as failure, but as signals to deepen assumption, strengthen emotional fidelity, and maintain unwavering attention to the inner reality. This is how momentum builds, as each successive session of vivid imagination compounds prior impressions, producing a steady acceleration of alignment between internal assumption and external manifestation, until life becomes increasingly responsive to inner fidelity. This is where subtle mastery is revealed, because consistent practice trains both conscious and subconscious minds to operate in harmony, reinforcing the law of assumption as an automatic, reliable mechanism within the practitioner's life. This is how faith is transformed into knowing, as repeated confirmation of manifestations, small and large, gradually erodes doubt, leaving only experiential certainty in the power of imagination and feeling to shape reality. This is where focus sharpens, because sustained attention to the inner scene teaches the mind to discriminate between transient thoughts and fully assumed realities, ensuring that energy is directed toward what truly matters. This is how patience becomes strategic, as persistent rehearsal teaches that the timing of outer manifestations is determined by the subconscious and not by anxious urging or conscious impatience, and trusting this timing is integral to success. This is where refinement emerges, because daily practice allows the student to adjust, enhance, and perfect the inner scene, heightening sensory detail, emotional resonance, and clarity, thereby increasing the potency of the assumption. This is how alignment strengthens, as the subconscious gradually synchronizes more and more aspects of life with the repeated inner reality, producing increasingly consistent and compelling external evidence. This is where empowerment deepens, as students realize that they control their destiny through the constancy of inner practice, and that the world responds predictably when assumption and feeling are maintained without interruption. This is how subtle guidance arises, because persistent practice sensitizes the practitioner to signs, synchronicities, and intuitive nudges, demonstrating that the subconscious communicates and coordinates events in response to faithful assumption. This is where mastery extends, as life itself becomes a laboratory, testing the practitioner's fidelity, reinforcing habits of daily rehearsal, and confirming that persistent, emotionally engaged imagination is the most reliable means of manifesting desires. This is how confidence consolidates, as repeated successes build an unshakable understanding of the law, leaving no room for skepticism, worry, or hesitation to interfere with creative authority. This is where the bridge between thought and reality is solidified, for consistent, emotionally complete assumption ensures that the subconscious acts without fail, translating imagination into external experience with precision and inevitability. This is how Neville's teaching culminates in practice, demonstrating that persistent, daily, emotionally charged assumption is the indispensable engine driving conscious creation and mastery over life itself. Envision the profound shift that occurs when gratitude becomes the emotional foundation of every imagined scene, transforming assumption from mere desire into a deeply felt reality, and accelerating manifestation in ways subtle yet undeniable. This is how Neville Goddard taught the power of gratitude, emphasizing that feeling thankful for the fulfilled desire, even before it appears externally, creates a magnetic resonance that aligns the subconscious with completion rather than longing or lack. This is where emotional alignment matters, because the subconscious responds to the quality of feeling, and gratitude infuses the inner scene with satisfaction, certainty, and joy, making manifestation inevitable and effortless. This is how consciousness is elevated, as students learn to inhabit the state of already having, experiencing the result with all senses, and a heart full of appreciation, bypassing anxiety, doubt, and resistance that arise from unmet desire. This is where subtle mastery reveals itself, for gratitude amplifies the potency of assumption, converting visualization from a mechanical exercise into a vibrant, lived experience that the subconscious cannot ignore. This is how inner power is consolidated, because when gratitude saturates the imaginal act, the practitioner no longer chases outcomes but allows life to respond naturally to the confident, appreciative state cultivated within. This is where focus intensifies, as the student directs attention not merely to the desired object or event, but to the feeling of completion and thankfulness, embedding it deeply within the subconscious mind as unshakable reality. This is how patience becomes effortless, for gratitude removes the tension of waiting and replaces it with contentment, creating a relaxed inner environment in which manifestation can occur smoothly and organically. This is where alignment between inner and outer worlds is reinforced, as each act of thankful assumption tunes circumstances, people, and opportunities to mirror the internal state, producing external evidence that reflects the felt reality. This is how subtle signals are magnified, because a grateful mindset sensitizes the practitioner to synchronicities and confirmations, highlighting the unseen orchestration of events that validates the law of assumption in daily life. This is where empowerment blooms, as students recognize that the emotional atmosphere they cultivate, particularly one saturated with appreciation, dictates the quality and speed of manifestation more reliably than effort, struggle, or planning. This is how imagination and emotion fuse, for each latter exercise or desired scenario, when accompanied by gratitude, becomes a living experience that the subconscious accepts fully and faithfully executes in external reality. This is where resistance loses its grip, because as the presence of genuine thankfulness dissolves doubt, fear, and hesitation, leaving only clarity, confidence, and creative authority to guide life. This is how subtlety guides practice, teaching that the feeling of gratitude must be authentic and deeply internalized rather than superficial, as the subconscious responds only to true emotional conviction rather than forced sentimentality. This is where faith becomes tangible, as consistent gratitude within imagined scenes produces steady, observable results, reinforcing trust in the unseen creative power and the reliability of assumption. This is how the mind learns refinement, because repeated practice of grateful assumption enhances the vividness, emotional depth, and clarity of internal scenes, increasing the likelihood and precision of manifestation. This is where resonance amplifies influence, as gratitude aligns vibrationally with the desired state, creating an irresistible pull that attracts corresponding external circumstances effortlessly. This is how discipline integrates with joy, since regular incorporation of gratitude into nightly visualization transforms practice from obligation into a fulfilling, emotionally rich ritual that sustains both belief and momentum. This is where manifestation becomes natural, as life reflects the internal atmosphere of appreciation, producing confirmations large and small that continually reinforce the power of assumption and the law of imagination. This is how Neville's teaching comes full circle, revealing that gratitude is not merely an accessory to conscious creation, but the emotional catalyst that turns imagined possibility into lived reality, making every desired outcome feel already accomplished and eternally assured. Ask yourself what it would mean to inhabit life as if every desire were already accomplished, to move, think, and feel in alignment with the reality you wish to experience, and to make that inner conviction so vivid that the outer world cannot help but conform. This is how Neville Goddard elevated the principle of assumption, teaching that the highest mastery comes from living in the state of fulfillment, where the inner mind is saturated with the reality of what has been imagined, leaving no room for doubt or longing. This is where inner consistency matters, for when thoughts, emotions, and actions all reflect the assumed state, the subconscious is fully impressed, orchestrating events to match with precise fidelity. This is how faith transforms into knowing, because the practitioner no longer waits for confirmation, but embodies the result internally, feeling every detail as already present, experiencing life from the perspective of fulfillment rather than anticipation. This is where subtle mastery is revealed, as students recognize that their external world mirrors the state they maintain within, and that the act of living as if collapses the gap between imagination and reality. This is how empowerment intensifies, for every decision, interaction, and choice is filtered through the lens of already having, allowing life to flow smoothly in alignment with assumed truth and producing results effortlessly. This is where patience becomes natural, because the inner conviction eliminates anxiety over timing or method, trusting the subconscious to organize circumstances in perfect correspondence with the internal scene. This is how imagination, feeling, and action converge, as the student learns that outer behavior, when congruent with inner assumption, strengthens the impression on the subconscious, amplifying the potency of manifestation. This is where resilience is cultivated, because by inhabiting fulfillment internally, external setbacks, contradictions, or delays are no longer perceived as threats, but as temporary conditions that cannot alter the ultimate outcome of the assumed state. This is how subtle signals are magnified, as the practitioner becomes attuned to synchronistic events, encounters, and opportunities that reflect the lived assumption, deepening trust in the unseen orchestration of life. This is where clarity of intent sharpens, for living as if demands a precise, unwavering image of desired reality, eliminating scattered attention and weak assumptions that dilute the creative force. This is how internal authority asserts itself, because by consistently inhabiting fulfillment, the practitioner demonstrates to both mind and circumstance that imagination, when felt fully, is the ultimate determinant of reality. This is where integration occurs, as the law of assumption moves from abstract concept to habitual, lived experience, shaping not only outcomes but perception, attitude, and the quality of every moment. This is how joy amplifies creation, for living from the state of fulfillment naturally produces gratitude, contentment, and confidence, which in turn strengthen the subconscious impression and accelerate external manifestation. This is where refinement deepens, as students learn to maintain the inner scene under all conditions, training attention, emotion, and imagination to remain faithful despite distractions, doubts, or challenges. This is how empowerment becomes effortless, because once internal conviction is complete, outer circumstances automatically conform, requiring no struggle, persuasion, or manipulation, only continued fidelity to the felt reality. This is where subtle mastery is maintained, for life itself becomes a mirror, continually reflecting the quality, precision, and emotional intensity of the assumed inner state, teaching the student to trust their creative power unconditionally. This is how freedom is realized, as the practitioner understands that external circumstances cannot dictate reality. The inner state is sovereign, and life responds predictably to imagination experienced as fact. This is where alignment with desire becomes instinctive, as every action, thought, and emotion is guided by the assumption of fulfillment, producing an effortless harmony between internal conviction and external manifestation. This is how the bridge between imagination and reality is fully crossed, as living as if transforms potential into actual, demonstrating that the felt assumption within is the true source of all creation, and that life faithfully obeys the inner law of belief. This is where Neville's teaching reaches its zenith, showing that the ultimate mastery of life is achieved not through effort or external control, but by consistently living from the state of already having, making imagination the sovereign architect of reality. Envision the final stage where every thought, feeling, and action align seamlessly with the inner reality of fulfilled desire, and the practitioner recognizes that life itself is a canvas upon which imagination paints with perfect precision and authority. This is how Neville Goddard defined mastery, teaching that conscious creation is not a technique reserved for the few, but a law accessible to anyone willing to assume, feel, and live their desired reality fully and consistently. This is where integration occurs, as imagination, emotion, and assumption converge to form a continuous, self-sustaining cycle of creation, where inner fidelity naturally produces external evidence without force or struggle. This is how sovereignty is realized, for the practitioner no longer reacts to circumstance, but directs life from within, knowing that the subconscious is an obedient servant that faithfully executes the vividly assumed scene. This is where subtle mastery thrives, as repeated practice cultivates the ability to maintain internal states under all conditions, neutralizing doubt, distraction, and opposition, while reinforcing alignment between inner vision and outer manifestation. This is how life becomes effortless, because every action, decision, and interaction emerges naturally from the state of fulfillment, allowing the outer world to harmonize with the inner blueprint without conscious manipulation or strain. This is where empowerment solidifies, as the practitioner comprehends that imagination, when experienced fully and felt as real, is the ultimate creative force, and that every circumstance, opportunity, and relationship responds to the fidelity of inner assumption. This is how synchronicity flourishes, because the subconscious orchestrates people, events, and circumstances to reflect the internal state, producing confirmations that are both subtle and striking, reinforcing the reliability of conscious creation. This is where clarity sharpens, as every desired outcome is imagined with precision, detail, and emotional completeness, ensuring that the subconscious receives a coherent and compelling directive to manifest reality faithfully. This is how freedom is achieved, for the practitioner understands that life is not controlled by external conditions but by the quality and intensity of assumed inner states, making every moment an opportunity to consciously shape experience. This is where trust becomes instinctive, as repeated manifestations build unshakable confidence in the law of assumption, removing the need for validation or evidence outside the inner conviction itself. This is how refinement continues, because mastery is dynamic. Each imagined scene, assumption, and emotional rehearsal strengthens the subconscious impression and enhances the precision of future creations, creating an upward spiral of conscious authority. This is where resilience is inherent, as setbacks, contradictions, or delays are no longer feared, recognized instead as temporary reflections that cannot alter the ultimate fulfillment of the inner state assumed as real. This is how joy and gratitude accelerate creation, for the practitioner experiences every manifestation as already accomplished, infusing life with satisfaction that amplifies the magnetic power of imagination and feeling. This is where alignment becomes seamless, as external reality consistently mirrors inner assumption, demonstrating that the subconscious responds without fail when impressed with clarity, emotion, and persistence. This is how discipline becomes liberation, because regular, vivid rehearsal of desired states trains the mind to operate effortlessly in harmony with universal law, producing results with grace and inevitability. This is where imagination attains sovereignty, as the practitioner realizes that life is entirely responsive to inner fidelity, and the outer world conforms naturally to the experienced reality within. This is how conscious creation reaches its apex, with every act, thought, and feeling guided by assumed fulfillment, ensuring that life unfolds predictably, harmoniously, and powerfully according to internal conviction. This is where Neville's teaching is fully embodied, demonstrating that mastery is not theoretical, but practical. Imagination, feeling, and assumption, held consistently and vividly, are sufficient to shape all aspects of life, making the practitioner the deliberate architect of their reality. This is how the journey culminates, revealing that true mastery lies not in controlling the world, but in perfecting the inner state, where life invariably reflects the assumptions and feelings one consistently inhabits, proving that consciousness is the ultimate creative force and imagination the master key to all experience.